Okay, welcome back, Connecting Point. So last week we left off with David having lost everything, right? He lost his job, his status in the community where he lived and worked. He's lost contact with his wife and his best friend. Saul is now resolved that he's going to kill David, right? He's already made many attempts on David's life, and David has stayed by Saul's side throughout so many attempts on his life. Maybe David had hoped that he could help Saul come to peace, through his music or his presence with him or his loyalty. That maybe their relationship could be restored and that David could keep his place in the community. But Saul is not just in a bad mood this time. He is adamant that David is a threat to his throne and must be destroyed. So David is on the run. He's running for his life. And I want to take us into a table talk with this. Maybe you've experienced a season of grief and loss in your life, maybe a loss of a job or someone you loved, maybe the loss of an important relationship that has just deteriorated to the point where there's nothing left to salvage. Where do you go? Where do you run when you are experiencing this loss and grief and there just seems like there's no hope? Where do you go? What do you do in those seasons, in those times? Take a few minutes and share with one another. Okay, let's see what David does. 1 Samuel 21, starting at the beginning, verse 1. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David, trembling, and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here." And the priest answered David, "I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have kept themselves from women..." And David answered the priest, "Truly, women have been kept from us, as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. And David said to Ahimelech, Then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." And the priest said, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here." And David said, "There is none like that. Give it to me." So where does David go in this season of hopelessness? He runs to what is holy. He runs to a sanctuary, to a holy place, and to a holy man, a priest, where he can inquire of the Lord. The sanctuary is where we meet with God. David has already been anointed as king by this point, and David, like Ahimelech the priest, has been chosen. He's been set apart for particular work and service, for ministry, for prayer, for leadership. And this vocation and calling is not actually David's priority in this moment. His mind is solely focused on his physical needs, not his spiritual needs, even though he will need some spiritual sustenance for the road ahead. And we're reminded again that David is only a foreshadowing of Jesus. He's not perfect, just as a shadow is not the man. David is not the capital M Messiah. David is a man. He's fallen in all the ways that man can fall, spiritually, morally, mentally, physically. he's not so different from us, actually. Reading the story of David with all of his highs and lows gives us a real insight into the human heart. And it makes us feel right at home with all of our own successes and failures that we experience. And as we read David's story, we can get caught up in finding Jesus in his life. And we forget that there is some discernment needed in separating David's godly choices from his fleshly choices, right? Not all of David's actions are worth imitating. David lies. And as a matter of fact, David has become pretty adept at skirting the truth to save his own skin. If you'll remember back in chapter 19, David and Michal worked together to deceive Saul. And then chapter 20, which we read last week, David and Jonathan were in on a ruse together to mislead Saul. And now David is lying to Ahimelech. I don't know that I would have done anything differently had I been in David's shoes. I probably would have lied too. But thankfully, we're not talking about the story of my misdeeds. We're going to talk about David's story. And as we do, one could reach the conclusion that there's a pattern forming here for David, right? We can give David the benefit of the doubt, and say that, well, he only wanted to protect Ahimelech, that he wanted the consequences of his deceit to fall on him and not on the priest. But if you're familiar with David's story at all, you know about his infidelity with Bathsheba and then the subsequent murder of Bathsheba's husband. And I want to suggest, when you think about that incredible sin that David fell into, it doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It begins somewhere. And maybe this is it, where he's becoming more and more comfortable with bending the truth, right? We're reminded through this that saying that sin will always take you further than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and make you pay more than you want to pay. Right? The choices that we make today matter. They matter for us, and they matter for future generations. They matter for the long term. And then there's the bread. The only bread available to David is holy bread. The bread of the presence would have been 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel. You can read the background info on this in Leviticus 24 for your homework if you like. But these loaves that are given to David are set apart for Ahimelech. This is Ahimelech's portion that the priest is giving to David. And the Lord had given Moses very specific instructions that only Aaron and his sons, the line of priests, should eat the holy bread, and they should eat it in the holy place as a memorial to the Lord. However, there were instances in the Old Testament where the preservation of life called for a temporary omission of the law. And the priest Ahimelech discerned that this was such an occasion, that David's life was at stake, possibly needing this sustenance. And so therefore it was okay to, dismiss the law for this instance, right? And it could be said that David's lies actually fall into this category as well, right? Because David's goal in his lying is the preservation of life, as opposed to lying in order to distort reality or to manipulate the circumstances for one's personal gain. Right? We could say that David is in the clear here because of this. Right? In the Gospels, Jesus commented on this event. He commends Ahimelech for his discernment. He reprimands the Pharisees for their rigidity, and he claims lordship over the Sabbath. However, he does not comment on David's behavior. We're kind of left to judge for ourselves and use some discernment there. And then there's the holy relic. We can only speculate how Goliath's sword came to be in the sanctuary. The text doesn't say. However, the fact that it is in the sanctuary is quite possibly an indication that it had been previously dedicated to God, and that it's also holy and set apart, right? It would serve in the sanctuary as a reminder for the worshipers of this great saving work that the Lord had done for them. So David, in his hopelessness, comes to a holy place and receives bread and sword, right? We're not so different, actually. God's word is referred to as both bread and sword. There is a holiness, a set apartness to the Sunday gathering where we come together around the word of God to feed our souls and to find defense for the week ahead. And we take that which is sacred and holy along with us into our everyday lives as we leave from this time together surrounding our hearts and minds around the Word of God and the person of Jesus. David's interaction in the sanctuary with these holy things is in stark contrast to this other character that we meet in this story, Doeg. How would you like to have a name like Doeg? Right? You just know that this guy he's going to be a bad dude with a name like that. So the text says that he is an Edomite, and the Edomites are descendants of Esau. So in Genesis, you can read about the story of Esau and Jacob, how Esau was tricked by his younger brother Jacob and lost his birthright, lost his inheritance. And over and over again, when we hear of the Edomites, it's usually that they are opposed to God, to Yahweh in some way, and opposed to the people of God. So Doeg, when we hear the text calling Doeg an Edomite, we automatically think, okay, this person has set themselves in opposition to the people of God. And yet, he's working for Saul, we find out. Saul, who is supposed to represent the people of God. Let's see how this all plays out. Doeg has a very different approach compared to David to this holy place, to the holy man, and to the holy things of God. Right? He's not there to find God, to seek that which is holy, but he's there to perform this certain type of religion that suits him, that will benefit him, that he comes to use the holy things as a means of advancing his own career and agenda. So let's take a break here for a table talk. How do we treat the holy? Are we too familiar? Do we treat the things of God as they're there for our own use, or do we treat them with a good kind of respect, as something that is set apart by God, as sacred and holy? Take a few minutes and discuss. Okay, picking up in verse 10 of chapter 21, and David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." And David took these words to heart, and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate, and let spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see the man is mad. Why have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" So in David's flight from Saul, he's been assisted by Jonathan, by Michal, by Samuel, and now he's seeking refuge with the enemies of Saul. And in this song has tormented Saul. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands, has been used by his own people, and now it's made its way to Saul's enemies. And we find that David's reputation precedes him, and that he has yet another talent. He is an actor. We've seen David as a shepherd and a warrior, a musician, and now we find he's a thespian too. Some guys just get all the talent. But David quickly realizes that he's not safe there in Gath. So after committing a teensy bit of vandalism and self-denigration, he moves on. And for time's sake, so must we. So let's move on to chapter 22. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gath said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold, depart and go to the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Now Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give you every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as at this day." Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Then the king sent to summon Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house. The priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait as at this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king, "And who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No, let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little." And the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." And the king said to the guard who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David." And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, "You turn and strike the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword. Both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping.'" So last week, Doug gave us this grid of how to understand the events that we see around us and in the Bible. We have, firstly, our own agency, right? The way that we affect our circumstances. Second, there's the agency of those around us, particularly the power players in our world and in the story. And thirdly, there's the providence of God. So there are a number of threads that have been weaved into this passage that began much earlier in the story, and you probably don't remember all of these earlier stories. So I want to try and highlight some of these threads so that we can see the agency of these actors and the providence of God at work in these very dark circumstances. So first of all, David is joined by family and a few hundred others who are in debt, in distress, or embittered because of Saul's tyranny. They're ready to follow David, even if that means being an outcast in society and being hunted by the law. It may be worth noting that David had once been the head of all of Saul's army until a few chapters ago, chapter 18, he was demoted to only 1,000 soldiers he was in charge of, and then now he's been relegated to these 400 bitter souls, and I'm guessing they weren't exactly the cream of the crop. These misfits kind of sound a little bit to me like that odd group of tax collectors, traitors, and terrorists, and trawlers that we meet in the New Testament who are following Jesus. David begins this wilderness season by returning to Moab. It seems that not everyone, though, was cut out for this life of running and hiding in the wilderness. It's no life for David's aging parents. So David makes arrangements with the king of Moab. And you may remember something about Moab. We studied this maybe about a year and a half ago, that David's great-grandmother was a Moabite, and you might remember her, Ruth, it was her name. So David still has some connections in Moab, clearly, and he's able to hide out there in a stronghold and have his parents kept safe. That is until he receives this prophecy from Gad. And Gad is a prophet, much like Samuel, he will serve David for many years. He'll come up a couple more times in the story of David's life. And he is able to speak to David on behalf of God. From verse 7, Saul addresses his servants as the people of Benjamin. We find that Saul has been favoring his own tribe, Benjamin. You may recall back in chapter 8 when the people were asking for a king. Oh, we need a king that will protect us and make us just like all the other nations. Well, Samuel warned them, prophesying that, well, if you get a king over you, then that king is going to take the best of your fields and your flocks and your orchards, and he's going to give them to his officials and servants. And now here we find that's exactly what Saul has been doing, and he's been doing so particularly for the advancement of his own tribe. Fourthly, in keeping with our theme of holiness, we find Saul sitting on a hill under a tamarisk tree, spear in hand. He's setting himself apart as a kind of holy man and a holy place. He's conducting business in the high places reminiscent of this book of Judges, the judges of Israel. And then he's under the tamarisk tree. This kind of tree is associated with the worship of Yahweh. And then his spear in his hand just lends to the whole veneer of rulership. And it means bad news, right? These servants that are attending Saul will have seen Saul pin someone to the wall with that spear a time or two. And no one wants to make him mad when he has that spear in his hand. Unfortunately for them, Saul is already in one of his moods, and he is ranting and raving about how David was lying in wait to kill me, and Jonathan, he orchestrated the whole thing, and you all have conspired against me. Right? Saul is so paranoid at everyone, he doesn't know who to throw his spear at this time. Enter Doeg. Doeg tells him what he wants to hear. All right, and notice that Doeg doesn't bother to explain that Ahimelech acted to help David with the understanding that David was on assignment from Saul. Right, in a sense, Ahimelech believes that he's serving Saul by helping David. But Doeg leaves that part out, right? It doesn't feed Saul's paranoia, and it doesn't gain him any points. So now Saul is going to set things right by destroying these priests. Right? Saul seems to believe that the priests and servants should be set apart for Saul. He doesn't acknowledge that which has already been set apart by God for God. He has elevated himself to the position of God as the Holy One, that these things and people ought to be set aside, set apart for. As ghastly as Saul's actions are, we find that these are not outside the providence of God. If you remember Eli from the beginning of 1 Samuel, he had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who badly perverted justice and perverted the laws of God. And poor Ahimelech and his family, he is the great-grandson of Eli, the grandson of Phinehas. You can read that story from chapter 2. A man of God came to Eli and prophesied concerning the sins of his son, Hophni and Phinehas. And he said, and I'll read it to you from chapter 2, starting in verse 31. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. Then in distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel, and there shall not be an old man in your house forever. The only one of you whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep his eyes out, to grieve his heart, and all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men. Oh, it sends a chill down your spine, doesn't it? Does God orchestrate the killing of these 85 priests? No, absolutely not. That's not what's happening. However, does God allow the consequences of sin and evil to be played out by these evil agents of Saul and Doeg? Yes, we can be sure our sin will find us out, and it won't just be you that's affected, right? In this case, Hophni and Phinehas's wickedness affects their descendants for generations. And it's not just Hophni and Phinehas. Eli was very complacent in the whole incident too, if you'll remember. But there's a silver lining here, if you can call it that this massacre is actually part of a shift that is taking place from the location of Nob to Jerusalem, which will eventually be the center of religious life for the Jews for the long term. Again, I don't know if you can call it a silver lining, but maybe it's something of a positive note. One more thread I want to pull out. Notice that Saul tells Doeg to take the lives of the priests. But Doeg chooses this moment to show his loyalty and goes well above and beyond the call of duty, right? It says he killed the 85 priests and then carried on to the city of Nob, both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep. If you back up to chapter 15, maybe you remember, this was quite a while ago though now, as Saul had been commissioned by God to completely destroy the enemies of Israel, which were the Amalekites. He was to completely destroy them, right? Just like Doeg just now completely destroyed the city of Nob. That was what Saul was supposed to do to the Amalekites. But Saul didn't do that. Saul spared the things that he thought were of value to him. The choice animals, the king, the best of everything he spared, rather than committing to destruction as God had said. In other words, Saul refused to carry out the command of God to kill the enemies of God, and now he commands the enemy of God to kill the people of God. David writes in Psalm 52 when he hears about this slaughter of the house of Ahimelech, "Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day. Your tongue plots destruction like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. Right? Saul is lying. He is distorting reality. And as a result, he's become the enemy of Israel. Saul, in his tyranny, is seeking to crush the people of God. And he joins in with the enemy of Israel, Doeg, who is manipulating the circumstances to his own advantage. And the passage closes with this glimmer of hope in that Abiathar managed to escape and find safety with David and his company. I want to just close with a quote from Eugene Peterson, and then we'll have a table talk to end. Peterson says this in commenting about this chapter. One of the distressing and distressingly frequent corruptions that works its way into the spiritual life is the loss of connection between who God is and who we are. We say the name God, we enter a sanctuary, we pray, but often the slightest tone of falsehood begins to creep in. A subtle dishonesty that gets into our speech and our action. The religious place offers an occasion to use God instead of submitting to him. Instead of becoming more before God, we become less. David is an antidote to this. We read David to cultivate a sense of reality for a true life, an honest life, a God-aware and God-responsive life. Let's close with this table talk. What kind of posture should we use to approach God? How can we cultivate that in our lives? And take some time to pray for one another. We're praying for you, and we just wish and pray blessing upon you, and hope you have a very good week. Take care.